a revelation that unfolded not over months, but in 72 hours that shattered the illusion of diplomatic progress, 72 hours that exposed a calculated deception at the highest levels of international politics, 72 hours that may have permanently altered the structure of global governance as we know it. What Vladimir Putin did this week crossed a line that the international community had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Volodymyr Zelensky did not hesitate. He responded with precision, with audacity, and with a strategic brilliance that has left even his critics in stunned silence. What you are about to hear is not speculation, it is not theory. It is the detailed account of how one leader's deception was exposed, how another leader's countermove changed everything, and how the United Nations, the institution that has anchored global diplomacy since 1945, began to fracture before the world's eyes. For 18 months now, there had been signals, not from official Kremlin statements, not from formal diplomatic channels, just signals that Vladimir Putin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been predictable in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a choreography that Western analysts have studied for decades. But what set off alarm bells in Washington, London, and Brussels this January was that the choreography went silent. Intelligence officers who monitor Russian strategic communications know the indicators, the sudden reshuffling of key personnel in the foreign ministry, the unusual frequency of encrypted communications between Moscow and Beijing, the quiet withdrawal of senior diplomats from Geneva, sudden cancellation of scheduled military exercises. All of that went quiet. And whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. For months, Putin had been publicly championing what he called the 2026 peace framework, a comprehensive proposal that he claimed would end the conflict in Ukraine, restore stability to Eastern Europe, and usher in what he described as a new era of cooperative security. The proposal looked reasonable on paper. It included ceasefire provisions, humanitarian corridors, prisoner exchanges, and even language about respecting Ukraine's territorial integrity, with carefully worded exceptions that few outside the Kremlin fully understood. Western leaders were skeptical but cautiously engaged. The United Nations Secretary-General called it a foundation for dialogue. European officials spoke of cautious optimism. Even some voices in Washington suggested that perhaps, after years of bloodshed, Putin was finally ready to negotiate in good faith. They were wrong. Early Tuesday morning, Ukrainian intelligence services detected what they described as anomalous encrypted traffic between Russian military command centers, including communication patterns that had not been observed in over 3 years. These are the kinds of signals that Moscow only generates when they are signaling something very specific: imminent military escalation, territorial consolidation, or the preparation of a strategic fait accompli. Analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Russia was changing its strategic posture. And when a nuclear-armed power shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence agency on Earth pays attention. What Ukrainian operatives discovered over the next 48 hours would change everything, buried within intercepted communications and corroborated by sources inside the Russian government. Zelensky's intelligence team uncovered the truth. Putin's 2026 peace framework was never designed to end the war. It was designed to win it. The proposal was a trap, a meticulously constructed diplomatic deception intended to achieve 3 objectives simultaneously. First, to create a legally binding ceasefire that would freeze Russian territorial gains while Moscow rebuilt its depleted military forces. Second, to fracture Western unity by offering European nations desperate for peace a path toward normalized relations and resumed energy trade. Third, and most devastating, to use the United Nations as the guarantor of the agreement, thereby transforming the institution into an unwitting accomplice to territorial conquest. The intercepted documents revealed that Russia had already drafted post-agreement plans for the integration of occupied Ukrainian territories, the systematic suppression of Ukrainian identity, and the gradual expansion of Russian influence westward, all while the world celebrated peace. The warning issued by Ukrainian officials Wednesday night was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Source after classified briefing described Putin's scheme as unprecedented in its scope, dangerous in its sophistication, and perhaps most importantly, executable within weeks if left unexposed. But deception only works if the target hesitates. Zelensky did not. In fact, his response today was among the most strategically audacious we've seen in modern diplomatic history. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of confirming the intelligence, Zelensky convened an emergency session of Ukraine's National Security Council. These weren't the typical security briefings. These were War Council deliberations, the kind of meetings that Ukraine only convenes when they are preparing to fundamentally reshape the battlefield. But Zelensky understood that this battle would not be fought with missiles and drones. It would be fought with information, with diplomacy, and with the strategic deployment of truth. And so, in a move that stunned capitals around the world, Zelensky did something Putin never anticipated. He went public. Tonight, multiple international news organizations confirmed that Ukraine released comprehensive documentation of Russia's deception, including intercepted communications, internal Kremlin memoranda, and testimony from defectors with direct knowledge of the plot. Zelensky released the evidence before Putin could prepare a counter-narrative. He exposed the territorial integration plans. He exposed the military rebuilding timelines. He exposed the specific provisions within the peace framework that were designed to legally legitimize occupation. In other words, Zelensky targeted the architecture of the deception, the credibility that would have made it operational. This is what made the revelation so devastating to Moscow. Putin's peace trap wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of diplomatic maneuver that could permanently redraw the map of Europe if left unchallenged. And Zelensky, understanding that fully, responded with overwhelming informational force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. He didn't simply accuse Russia of bad faith. He didn't rely on rhetoric or emotional appeals. He provided evidence so comprehensive, so detailed, so irrefutable that even nations sympathetic to Moscow could not dismiss it. He released the documents in 12 languages simultaneously. He briefed NATO allies, non-aligned nations, and global South partners at the same time. He ensured that no government could claim ignorance and no leader could pretend the evidence didn't exist. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence analysts now believe that Putin's peace framework was designed to test the resolve of the Western alliance after 2 years of war fatigue and domestic political turmoil. Putin wanted to see whether European leaders would sacrifice Ukrainian sovereignty for the promise of cheap energy and economic stability, but instead the opposite happened. Western capitals didn't waver. They united behind Ukraine with a speed and coordination that was so decisive, so unified, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily. But today, Zelensky did. Senior diplomats speaking with international media under anonymity described Putin's strategy as strategic gaslighting, a way to make the victim of aggression appear unreasonable for refusing peace. But Zelensky proved today that Ukraine remains both vigilant and strategically sophisticated. His information campaign was not only comprehensive, it was timed so precisely that Russia's foreign ministry was caught completely off guard, unable to formulate a coherent response for nearly 18 hours. That delay matters because it shows Moscow was not prepared for exposure. It shows that Putin is not operating from a position of strength, he is operating from desperation. As reports continued coming in throughout the week, we learned more about the scale of Zelensky's diplomatic offensive. Ukrainian ambassadors carried out simultaneous briefings in 47 capitals, forcing governments to publicly acknowledge the evidence. Zelensky personally addressed the European Parliament, the British Parliament and the United States Congress via video link within a single 24-hour period. Ukrainian cyber units operating in coordination with allied partners reportedly disrupted Russian propaganda networks attempting to discredit the revelations. This wasn't just a press release, this wasn't just a diplomatic protest, this was information warfare at the highest level. This was strategic communication designed to reshape global perception. And reshaping perception is the one thing Putin has struggled to achieve since the invasion began. For every propaganda victory Moscow has attempted, Ukraine has countered with something that undermines Russian credibility further. Remember, Putin thought the West would grow tired. He thought European unity would fracture under the pressure of energy costs and refugee flows. He thought the United States would become too distracted by domestic politics to maintain its commitment. He thought Ukraine itself would eventually accept a negotiated surrender disguised as peace. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Western resolve is strengthening, European unity is deepening, American commitment is being reaffirmed, and Ukraine has demonstrated that it possesses not just military courage, but strategic genius. What makes this moment so critical and so unpredictable is that Putin's peace trap was exposed at a time when he is under extraordinary domestic pressure. Russian military hardliners want total victory and territorial expansion. Russian oligarchs want sanctions relief and restored access to Western markets. Russian security services want regime stability and the suppression of internal dissent. The Russian public wants an end to casualties and economic hardship. Putin is balancing these demands while fighting a war that has cost far more in blood and treasure than he ever anticipated. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability. The peace trap was designed to extract maximum benefit from minimum concession, to achieve through diplomacy what Russia could not achieve through force. Its exposure represents a catastrophic intelligence failure for Moscow and a profound humiliation for Putin personally. The United Nations Security Council emergency session, now concluded after 12 hours of heated debate, was designed to signal that the international community is not willing to allow diplomatic institutions to be weaponized. Multiple delegations said plainly that Russia's manipulation of the peace process was inconsistent with the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter. That is diplomatic language for Russia attempted to use this institution as a tool of conquest, and we will not permit it. You don't usually hear that tone in the Security Council chamber unless something fundamental is at stake, but the damage may already be done. Several nations, including key members of the Global South, have announced they are reassessing their relationship with UN-led peace initiatives. Others have questioned whether the United Nations can remain a credible forum for conflict resolution when permanent Security Council members use it for strategic deception. The fractures are appearing, and they may prove irreparable. Meanwhile, Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a powerful, measured speech Thursday evening. He said, "We were offered poison disguised as medicine. We were offered surrender wrapped in the language of peace. But Ukraine sees clearly. Ukraine knows the difference between genuine diplomacy and strategic deception." He said, "Today, we did not just expose a lie. We defended the very concept of truth in international relations. We showed the world that integrity still matters." And he said, "To those who designed this trap, you underestimated us. You underestimated our intelligence. You underestimated our resolve. And you underestimated our friends. That miscalculation will cost you." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a leader who understands just how high the stakes have become and who has demonstrated the strategic sophistication to navigate them. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's peace trap wasn't isolated. Along with the diplomatic deception, Belarus also began repositioning military units near the Ukrainian border in patterns consistent with previous offensive preparations. Russian naval vessels in the Black Sea increased aggressive maneuvers targeting civilian shipping lanes. Chinese state media dramatically increased information operations targeting European public opinion, pushing narratives about Western warmongering and Ukrainian intransigence. All of this happened within the same 72-hour period. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. The peace trap may have been just one element of a coordinated campaign designed to achieve breakthrough on multiple fronts simultaneously. Its exposure may have disrupted a much larger operation. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a renewed military offensive designed to achieve territorial gains before Western military aid can arrive. Another is that Moscow is attempting to create chaos within Western alliance structures by exposing disagreements about how to respond. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to create conditions for a negotiated partition of Ukraine that leaves Russia in permanent control of occupied territories while claiming diplomatic victory. But today, Zelensky took that card off the table. He didn't negotiate in secret. He didn't accept ambiguous compromises. He didn't allow the narrative to be controlled by Moscow. He seized the initiative and forced the world to confront the truth. What we're watching now is a test of institutional resilience. Russia wants to see whether international organizations can be manipulated without consequence. Ukraine wants to show that truth and transparency remain powerful weapons. European leaders want to prevent a precedent that would undermine diplomatic institutions for generations, and the United States wants to prevent the emergence of a new international order where deception faces no accountability. The outcome of this test will shape global politics for decades. Tonight, we've heard from diplomatic sources who are now monitoring emergency consultations across multiple capitals. They say European leaders are preparing a comprehensive new sanctions package targeting Russian officials directly involved in the deception campaign. They say NATO is accelerating military assistance deliveries that have been delayed by bureaucratic processes. And they say Russia's decision to weaponize the peace process is likely part of a broader strategic recalibration intended to test Western limits before the American presidential transition. But Ukraine is not retreating. In fact, Ukraine is advancing diplomatically, informationally, and strategically. Their response this week, comprehensive, coordinated, and devastating, sent a message to Moscow that deception will be exposed and punished. And it sent a message to the world that Ukraine remains a sophisticated actor capable of defending itself on every front. As the weeks go on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with his peace trap and what he plans to do now that it is being exposed. But what we do know is that Zelensky's masterstroke was timely. It prevented a diplomatic catastrophe that could have legitimized occupation. It strengthened Western unity at a moment of potential fracture, and it demonstrated that Ukraine possesses strategic capabilities that extend far beyond the battlefield. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the coming days. If he escalates militarily, this moment will be remembered as the trigger for a dangerous new phase. If he retreats diplomatically, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared and united. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be uncertain. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is recalculating, means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he has learned many times before, but perhaps never so painfully. Deception requires secrecy, and secrecy cannot survive determined opposition. Strategic traps only work when the target doesn't see them coming, and Volodymyr Zelensky sees everything. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear: Ukraine has proven itself not just a military power, but a strategic one. The United Nations faces an existential crisis of credibility that may reshape global governance. And the world is watching as two visions of international order collide with consequences none of us can fully predict. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.